Hello, and welcome to Things We Said Today, our bi-weekly podcast about anything and everything to do with the Beatles, collectively and individually, past, present, things to come if we get word. I'm Allan Kozinn, the author of The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop and Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, and co-author with Adrian Sinclair of the McCartney Legacy series, Volume 2, due out December 10th, not far from now. Um, I'm joined by my esteemed co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you know as the host of the syndicated Beatles radio show Every Little Thing, and a co-host of the solo Beatles podcast Talk More Talk. And you may also know his own YouTube channel, Ken Michaels Radio, which is packed with Beatles-related interviews and all kinds of good stuff. Hello, Ken. How's it going?
Hi, Allan, and hi, Darren. We've got
Hello.
some show in store this time. Very special guest.
We do. And Darren Devivo, who has been a DJ at WFUV FM 90.7 in the New York area for the last 4 decades, since February 1984. If you're not in the vicinity of New York, you can hear him and everything else on WFUV at WFUV.org. Hello, Darren.
Hello, Alan. Hello, Ken. Howdy, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, and today we're going to be joined by Elliot Mintz. He almost doesn't need an introduction. Everybody who follows the Beatles enough to watch this podcast knows Elliot. We've had him on twice before. He was the host of the Lost Lennon tapes, 219 hour-long shows. Well, the first one was 3 hours, of lots and lots of unreleased Lennon recordings, and it was a great experience. I remember it vividly. Um, also, he was a very close friend of John and Yoko's all through the 70s, and also represented Dylan and Paris Hilton, also, various people as a media consultant. Before that, he was a radio guy and a TV guy, interviewed John and Yoko for both radio and television, a lot of which is in his YouTube channel archive. You can check out a lot of the interviews he did over the years during his radio and TV times. He has a new book, We All Shine On, about his time with John and Yoko. And it's a fascinating read. I really enjoyed it. And we'll be talking to Elliot for, gosh, it's close to 2 hours right after the news. And Ken will give us that.
Okay, thank you, Allan. There's a bit of news to get to, and especially some items that happened today. We're recording this on November the 15th. First, we note the passing of music legend Quincy Jones. We know him for so many years, producing legendary acts like Michael Jackson, Frank Sinatra, you name it, Leslie Gore. Paul McCartney issued a statement. He said, "Dear Quincy Jones has passed and left those of us who knew him feeling sad. He was supremely talented, and I felt privileged to have known him for many years. He was friends with George Martin, the Beatles producer, and between the two of them produced some very fine music. Quincy, or Quince, or Q, as he was known, always had a twinkle in his eye and had a very positive, loving spirit, which infected everyone who knew him. His work with Michael Jackson is, of course, legendary, and he had so many other strings to his musical bow. My main recollections of him were always the private moments that we shared, and I will never stop thanking Nancy for always arranging to visit him when we were in Los Angeles. These visits were fun and inspiring. His long career stretches back to the early days when he was a trumpet player, then a band leader, then a producer of many great records. But it is as a friend I would like to remember him. We always had fun in his presence, and his legend will continue through the years. But it is those private moments we were lucky enough to have with the great man that I will always remember fondly. We send our love and sympathies to his family and all his many friends. Paul. Of Quincy's involvement with the Beatles, well, he produced Paul's duet with Michael Jackson, The Girl Is Mine, and arranged Ringo's song, Love Is a Many Splendid Thing, on Ringo's very first solo album, Sentimental Journey. And you even have to go back to with Michael Jackson Off the Wall because Michael recorded Paul's song Girlfriend, which Paul gave to Michael, and Quincy produced that as well. Of course, there was a big dispute in 2018 when Quincy gave an interview to the New Yorker and called the Beatles the worst musicians on earth. Later, Quincy called Paul McCartney and said he never really said those things, and apparently Paul didn't take it badly. um, Today is the big day when, if I can just grab it here, where did I put it? Here it is.
Family show, Ken. Careful. Okay.
Here we go. This baby just came out. The archival box set for George Harrison's 1973 album, Living in the Material World. I just bought it right before the start of this show. I haven't even opened it yet, but I have heard the outtakes, and most likely we're going to be doing our next show on Living in the Material World and everything in the box set. All right. Just heard from producer and musician Bruce Sugar, known most to Beatles fans for his production and songwriting for Ringo's albums and EPs. He has said that the Beatles recording of Now and Then has been nominated for Record of the Year for the 2025 Grammy Awards, of which Bruce was involved. And the Beatles' Now and Then was also nominated for Best Rock Performance. Two nominations for that song. And wait, there's more.
More.
Because the Mind Games Ultimate Collection Super Deluxe Edition has been nominated for Best Boxed or Special Limited Edition Package, with production and creative direction overseen by Sean Ono Lennon and Simon Hilton. And Sean is quoted as saying, "I am absolutely thrilled that the John Lennon Mind Games box set that we worked on so hard on for several years has been nominated for a Grammy Award. It has been the honor of a lifetime for me to work on my father's music and to be able to reintroduce it to the world. My mom and I are so appreciative of the recognition." And this marks Sean Ono Lennon's first Grammy nomination and the 43rd nomination for the Lennon family, which includes one nomination for Julian Lennon, 2 wins and 5 nominations for Yoko Ono Lennon, and 7 Grammy Awards and 36 nominations for John Lennon for both the solo work and work with the Beatles. The Grammy Awards will take place February 2nd in Los Angeles. 3 things there for us Beatle fans to root for. Alan G. Parker is the director of the upcoming documentary on John Lennon called Borrowed Time, Lennon's Last Decade. He says the film will have a theatrical release in the spring next year, and there'll be a DVD Blu-ray to follow. A lot of stuff coming out on John. As we know, recently the Mind Games box set, Revival 69, that documentary, also Daytime Revolution, which, by the way, was just delayed as a release for DVD and Blu-ray. It's now coming out on December the 10th. Okay, so you have that, Daytime Revolution, the one-to-one concert, the one-to-one documentary, which we don't have a release date for yet, but it was shown in London just recently. And there were 3 showings there of one-to-one, but we haven't heard anything about a release yet or a theatrical showing here in the US. Okay. In our last show, you heard me announce that as a tribute to Denny Lane, the band McDonald's Farm have recorded their cover of Denny's song with Wings, Time to Hide. And Steve Holley, the last drummer in Wings, plays on the song, and they actually took Denny's harmonica playing and put it on the record. I'm hearing that the song will be available as a CD on the band's website. Proceeds from the sale will benefit Denny's estate. All right. A few other things. From the makers of Uncut, they are putting out their ultimate music guide on the Beatles. The front cover says that this issue contains new remixes in full, Get Back reviewed, the saga of Now and Then, the Christmas singles, classic interviews, rare photos, and in-depth reviews. It's 172 pages for that. The Fest for Beatle fans will be happening March 28th through the 30th. Special guests will include Jim McCarty of the Yardbirds, Colin Hampton of the Quarrymen with author and Mendip's steward, Colin Hall, Eddie Deason, the actor Eddie Deason, who we know for being in I Want to Hold Your Hand. I know everything there is to know about the Beatles. He really had like a imperson impersonation of Jerry Lewis, I would say, in his character.
He
Gary
was
Burr will be there. What's that?
wasn't Eddie Deason was
He was in
he
Greece. He was in Greece
and he
too.
was in the Polar Express?
I'm not aware of that.
Got to find that out now that I opened my app. I hope I'm right.
Okay. Gary Burr, I think I said, he'll be a special guest. Yvonne Innes, the widow of Neil Innes. Gary Astridge, Jay Bergen will be back, and Paul Saltzman, plus Liverpool and the Weaklings. Okay. News from our very own Darren Devivo. Yes, it is true. He's letting us know that Mary Hopkin will have a new album coming out in January called Doodling. And this is a brief description of the album taken from an email that's announcing pre-orders for it. Mary says, this album is a series of musical doodles. My only motivation was the question, wouldn't it be fun if I tried this or this or that? Nothing planned, just adding whatever random idea presented itself in the moment. No lyrics, no particular form, just layers of mostly improvised melodies and rhythms. And you can hear Mary's beautiful voice and Jessica, Morgan, and Chris's too. Guess those are all her
Her
children.
kids. And Tony
Uh,
Visconti.
yes. And they will be in layered harmonies and choirs on the record. There are orchestral, classical, folky, and more pop pieces. A real exploration and something different from Mary. And she painted the cover art as well, coming out in January. Nice to see that she keeps active. And our friends, the Weaklings, are back with a new album, The Weaklings Christmas, which is coming out November the 29th. And that's for CD, digital download, and streaming. Their new single, Must Be Santa, will be out November the 22nd. And as I mentioned at the very start of this newscast, a couple of things happened just today on November 15th. There's a new video that you can find on YouTube for Sunshine Life for Me, Sail Away Raymond, which is a bonus track on the Living in the Material World box set. Of course, George Harrison wrote the song and gave it to Ringo for the classic Ringo album. And the band is playing on there. David Bromberg, Klaus Vormann's on there. And this is with George on lead vocals doing Sunshine Life for Me, which I think we've all heard. It's not just the backing tracks from Ringo's take, it's an entirely different take. And you could actually watch this animated video online now. And also, there's now a second song from Ringo that has come out called Thankful. This is the song that will close his new country album called Look Up, which is due out January the 10th. And Alison Krauss shares vocals with Ringo on the song. Really good song. The two songs that have come out so far, and the production is just so good on these Ringo songs from T-Bone Burnett. So yeah, today, two new songs. Actually, one is not a new song with Sunshine Light for Me, but two new recordings to check out online of Ringo's new one, Thankful, and Sunshine Life for Me. That's all the news we have for now.
And
Okay.
I double checked. Eddie Deason is in the movie The Polar Express. He
Good.
plays the little know-it-all kid. Have you seen the?
Just
I don't
like
know if
in,
you.
just like in I Want to Hold Your Hand.
I don't know if either of you have seen the Polar Express.
I have.
Um, but it's yeah, he plays a little annoying little I don't know what type of animation that film is. It's fascinating the way they made it. It's a compute some sort of computer generated, but you could see knowing what Eddie Deason looks like today as an adult
Hmm.
and him shrinky dinked down to being a boy again. Um, so it's interesting and I was almost positive that was him, and I just wanted to check and make sure I was right. And I was.
Okay. Well, thank you for the news and for the further details about Eddie Deason. And now it's
That's
time.
why you keep me around.
It's why we pay you the medium bucks.
There you
Actually,
go.
we don't pay you anything, do we? No one pays anyone anything around here.
Mm-mm.
We should talk about that. Anyway, it's time to have a chat with Elliot. So we're going to have the swirly thing swirling. And when that finishes swirling, Elliot will be with us. Okay, and as promised, we are here with Elliot Mintz to talk about mainly about his new book, We All Shine On, John, Yoko, and Me. Uh, Probably a book a lot of us, I don't know if I should say we're waiting for it because I'm not sure anyone ever thought you would write it. It's a really, really interesting book. I enjoyed it immensely. And from my point of view, it should be like volume one of about four or five others because there is so much else that you've done that is not even touched on in this book. Um, the book ends really when John is shot. Um, that you represented Yoko subsequently, and you represented Bob Dylan, and you've represented so many other people, some of whom are just mentioned in passing in here, and I'd like to read all the rest of that stuff. So, I hope you're sharpening up your pen and getting ready for the sequels. No, you
I
don't look
wouldn't
like
say
you
that
want
I'm
to.
sharpening up my pen.
Well,
And
I mean, just so that it writes.
this one took a lot out of me to do, my own personal memoir, my own recollections of my life with the people that I interacted with. Um, Bob can do Chronicles 1, 2, and 3. And when I look at classic writers in my library, yeah, there were people who actually did 10 or 20 or 30 volumes of work in the course of their lifetime.
Mhm.
But maybe it was just this one. It took a lot out of me. I, I, I'd have to have a real good reason to start working on another.
Hmm. It reads so smoothly. It doesn't look like it was hard work for you. Although I guess one question would be, um, how again, given all the stuff that happened in the period you cover, how did you decide which things to focus on and which things to just sort of leave be?
Thank you for asking that question. It was one of the more difficult chores here. I worked in the book from midnight in the evening till 6 in the morning. I'm an insomniac. On this laptop that I'm sitting in front of, with two fingers, which is how I type. And I submitted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages to a writer's assistant who would go through it and make his individual suggestions. And the number one suggestion he would make was, if it doesn't keep the narrative moving, if it doesn't take us to another spot in the storytelling,
Hmm.
it had to go. And we couldn't hover too much on incremental material, details, tangential leads. I had to remain focused. And when I wasn't, in answer to your question, it had to do with a superb editor and later, my publisher, who basically said the same.
Hmm.
Because any one of the scenes that I described in the book, I could do 50 pages on. And even in the conversations with John and Yoko, even if they were taped and I had the transcript in front of me, there'd be thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. So what do I do by way of consolidating the interaction? I picked the key words, phrases, or timing that John and Yoko said something to me. The short way of answering your question is by saying uh, cautious editing.
Mhm. Okay. So on the 10th anniversary of the book, you can put out some of the outtakes and we'll read it
You
again.
were a very optimistic man talking to somebody
I
who, as
am.
I speak to you, is 4 months, 3 months away from his 80th birthday. I don't think in terms of 10 years from now.
Mhm. Um, one of the things that impressed me was that uh, it wasn't all sweetness and light. You touched on a number of the things that were not comfortable. Um, and various degrees of not comfortable, including, being in a position between John and Yoko when they were separated and saying, look, I'm not taking sides here. That must have been difficult. And um, I think was there um, a feeling that maybe you should suppress the stuff that wasn't comfortable and just do the happy stuff, or did you sort of realize that this gives it a texture that makes it more relatable, really, to everybody? Because we all know we've all at least dealt with famous people, and we know that it's not always sweetness and light. So, and I think a lot of just general readers out there at least know that intuitively.
When I embarked upon this, there was some advance ripplings through the net where people said, well, it's Elliot Mintz. He's one of those wind up plastic spokespeople type. And this is going to be basically a sycophant writing a love poem about John and Yoko.
Mhm.
Or it was going to be a group of people who would say he kept their secrets and he was trusted. And now, for a couple of bucks, he's rolling over and going to tell a salacious tale. And I understand why that point of view would exist with various people. I didn't want to just cut down the middle and appease both groups. I just took it to a different level of just telling an honest story about two people I loved, the nature of some sacrifices that I had to make in my personal life to accommodate them, and to try to hit a place in the reader's mind and heart where they may have gone through some of these emotional roller coasters that I did with other people. Among the three of you, you have been friends with people who have gotten divorces or separations, or two who were together with you around a dinner table around Thanksgiving or whenever it was, and they parted. And you had to make a decision, or they made it for you, as to who you were going to be with. In my case, during the John and Yoko separation, I told them anything that one of you says to me, I will let the other person know. I won't keep any secrets from either side. It put me in a very uncomfortable position, especially when I witnessed what I considered to be bad behavior. And I didn't scurry back to the phone to call Yoko to say, you wouldn't believe what John did last night. I did not do that. But if she asked how he was doing, I wouldn't say he's studiously working on new songs.
Okay. Um, there are apart from the John stuff, I mean, there are some things that maybe mentioned in passing. Well, in particularly, I'm thinking of Lenny Bruce's funeral, which you bring up mainly because you need to tell us how you knew Phil Spector before John knew Phil Spector. And I mean, first of all, that whole scene, when you imagine it as you're reading is just astonishing. You're going to Lenny Bruce's funeral and Phil Spector being there and hardly anybody else. Um, but what it raised for me is that in discussing that, you talked about Phil's songs, to know him is to love him and to do Ron Ron, all of these things, and talked about how that really, even and Elvis more than the Beatles, was the music you grew up on. And that was, that's sort of like what the Beatles are to us. That stuff was to you. And it also was to John. And I was wondering, were there ever times when you and John sat around and talked about that music and those performers, and if there was anything in his comments about it that was interesting because of the difference in perspective that you would have as a British person and an American? He's listening to American music from across the ocean, and you grew up with it right here. So I was wondering if there were things that he observed about it that stayed with you over the years.
Whereas we didn't spend a lot of time talking about music,
Hmm.
primarily because I'm not a musician and I can't, I see behind you a group of well-kept guitars. If you put one in my hand, I wouldn't know the first thing to do with it, except to be very careful. And I just don't know about things like backbeats and melody lines and things of that nature. And we didn't have, intensive conversations about the Beatles as a group per se. You're right. When I was first discovering music, it was Elvis and it was doo-wop groups. It was the music of the 50s, and much of it came through the musical genius of Spector. John, when the sailors would come home from merchant ships on the docks of Liverpool, they would carry with them batches of records. And it wasn't as if the BBC was constantly playing this kind of music. There was still the BBC. But the way Elvis affected John was exactly the way he affected me. And we had talked about him with great reverence until John finally met him and the bubble burst. Uh, John loved the early Spector music just because of the sound of it. He had this jukebox at the Dakota right off of the main kitchen, and it had some of his favorite tunes in it. And one of the early times I came to the Dakota and I was just exploring the contents because I was curious, what did John listen to? I noticed that he had two versions of Don't Step on My Blue Suede Shoes, one by Elvis, one by Carl Perkins. Did you know later I went on to briefly represent Carl Perkins?
No, but that'll be in your next book.
It'll be in the next book. One of the sweetest, most humble people I'd ever known. I introduced him to Bill Clinton. I asked why he had the two versions, and he said because he preferred the Carl Perkins version. He said he liked the slow entry of it more than the one that Elvis released. He was very big on the incremental sounds of music, stuff that I really at first couldn't get a grasp of. And he would dismiss it by saying, oh, look, it's not something I expect you to understand. In his own half truthful and half sardonic and dismissive way with me. But he loved Spector. I think it was in 1963. I was 17, 18, whatever I was. I had done an interview with the actor Sal Mineo. He had been a friend of Phil Spector. He was attending this very small memorial service. He asked if I'd like to come along. I did have some recollection of Lenny Bruce from living in New York and once going to Sam Goody and picking up one of his early albums. It infuriated my parents when they heard it coming through the speakers. And I went, and there was this man behind a podium with just a sprinkle of people. And he said some very kind words about Lenny. Sal would then introduce us, and I would become friends with Phil Spector. I would visit him at his, giant mansion with the Doberman pinchers and the armed guard and a loaded gun on every surface of every single table. And he would later be convicted of in the death of a woman that I was very, very close to, Lana Clarkson. So we had a very storied past. He was a very, very disturbed man.
It's kind of interesting that, as I was reading that you were friends with him of long standing, and then also friends with Lana Clarkson, and then, with John in the mix too. It's just kind of, it's all you wouldn't expect one person to have like those three connections. It was just sort of amazing. And there's a lot of that all through the book, just things that seem like amazing coincidences. I think before I pass you on to one of these others, I just want to make one observation because you mentioned in the book several times that you're not a celebrity and okay, these guys, all three of you are radio guys, and I've never been a radio guy, so I can say this. For normal people who sit around and listen to stuff on the radio guys are celebrities. I just wanted to point that out. So,
It's a moniker that I never hung on my front door. I try, even with respect to the book, I try to talk about it as the book, not my book.
mhm,
I try to keep my ego about all of this on a suspension burner.
yeah.
I was very, very comfortable talking behind a microphone without anybody knowing what I looked like.
Mhm.
And I still, after having done 50 of these, talking to a camera and saying hi and smiling, it's just very unlike me as a person. I've always been a bit more off the screen, shall we say.
Okay. So I'll pass you over to one of the other radio guys, Ken.
All right, I want to go back to the beginning of your relationship with John and Yoko, which all started when you interviewed Yoko on, was it KLOS or was it the other station,
No, it was
KPN?
KLOS.
Okay, for her Fly album, which you described as conceptual and experimental, confusing and elusive, but also somehow inspiring. And I know that in the past you told me that you think of Yoko as probably the most fascinating person you've ever known. What was it about this album that struck you when you heard it the first few times? And what made you want to, apart from her being married to John, want to interview her?
I did not want to interview her because she was married to John.
Hmm.
I would have interviewed her if she was a single person
Right.
or married to an anonymous being.
Hmm.
What attracted me to that album and her early work in general was originality. You can underscore that. I had never heard anybody like her before. It wasn't just a question of the uniqueness of her voice or lyrics, but the whole presentation. was just off the charts. We were just reminiscing about the kind of music I was raised on and Elvis. I had no knowledge about the avant-garde or, fringe music. I was just attracted to the way it made me feel, and it just made me think outside of my brain. But I think that's what drew me into it. But it's like me asking you when you played an album that moved you by somebody who intrigued you. In the beginning, you don't know exactly what it is,
Hmm,
but you have to listen to the next track. There's something that came at me.
right. You know what really struck me early on in this book is, well, from this interview with Yoko that led to seemingly every day getting phone calls from Yoko and from John. And it almost seems like a transcription of these phone interviews because word for word, we can hear Yoko saying this and you saying this to her. Did you remember? It seems like you remembered every word, and it's impossible with the hundreds of phone calls that you've done with these people. How could you possibly? It's, I feel like I was right there in the room with you talking to her on the phone and John.
Thank you very much for saying that. Uh, and a lot of people question, either my credibility or my memory. How could he possibly, 50 years later, recall in detail these moments? I don't really know. I spent most of this past year in this chair at this table in front of this screen. And when midnight or so rolled around and the night stood still, I did a kind of a brief meditation to kind of clear my brain. I did some breathing. I thought of a theme or something that he said or she said. And it just came to me. Now, of course, I don't remember every detail of hundreds of hours of conversation. Even if I did, that would be a 50,000 page volume, I guess, by transcript pages. But I ask you, have there been key moments in your life? Let's say when you first met somebody who you would go on to love, or when after you had been with somebody for a long time and they said that they wanted to have a meal with you to talk about something, you knew it was coming, or the words you may have said to a dying parent, or anybody who entered your world, somebody you got really mad at, where you could recall all these years later, each and every word of that conversation. I'm betting you could.
I don't think I could, but maybe if I tried real hard, I suppose. But
Maybe
yeah,
you've never had a kind of relationship. uh, I don't mean to get personal on a podcast.
yeah,
Have you been married?
yes,
Or are you still married?
yes, I am.
Do you remember the first time you met the woman who would become your wife?
Sure.
Without asking you, if I did, and I asked you, where was it, under what circumstances, what she said, what you may have said back, something like that, and you took a few moments to think about it, you don't think you could compose that?
I probably could come up with something close to it,
That's
but
what I tried to do.
Yeah.
yeah, okay. It's just this is one thing that struck me the most about your book, and I've loved every page of it. But the relationship between you and John and Yoko on the phone, they would call you at all hours of the day. They would call you even during the overnight, and seemingly not even being aware that there's a time difference between New York and Los Angeles. And even one time you were with a girlfriend, and then Yoko calls. Um, And when they start the conversation, it's not even hello, Elliot. It's just picking up where the last conversation left off. And it's the same with John and Yoko. It's just they took you in so quickly as a friend, and you seemingly were like their only confidant in their daily lives. Um, and I think the first time you felt that way was when they told you that they were seeing an herbalist to help them to help Yoko conceive.
Yes.
So it's amazing to think that so quickly after this one interview that you did with Yoko, everything kind of snowballed into this incredible friendship that the two of you had to the point where they felt comfortable calling you at any time and they expected you to just pick up the phone at any time of the day like you have no other life. And at the same time you were quite happy to do so, even though there were times when I'm sure it was very inconvenient for you.
It ultimately became somewhat debilitating.
Yeah.
I recount that there was one time where Yoko called and I spoke with her for 2 hours or so, and she had work to do, and we were just about to get off the phone, and she said that the light was blinking. I'm going to put you on hold. I think John just woke up and he wanted to talk to you. And I'd take a deep breath, and it would be John, and I would wind up talking with him. The longest interaction of that type was for 6 hours of me talking with both of them. And I only had to leave the conversation to prepare to put together my records for a radio show and took off.
Hmm.
Did the show for 4 hours. And when I came home, the phone was ringing. It, it helped them that I was an insomniac, so that when they woke at 6, 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, whenever they chose, it would be prime time for me 3 hours earlier,
Hmm.
2, 3, 4 in the morning. They knew that I would always be here. They knew I would be alone.
Hmm.
They knew nobody else would be listening. They knew I could keep my mouth shut. They didn't say anything to me that they read in the papers 3 or 4 days later. They admonished me not to even discuss the fact that I knew them.
Right.
I was available. And I loved them. And I listened to them without judgment. That's not to say I just nodded my head all the time. We disagreed on certain subjects, but we never argued. And I became increasingly more fascinating with the dynamic that they shared with each other. Part of me felt that I was getting sucked into a parallel universe to the one I was trying to live as a guy in my late 20s or early 30s, whatever it was. And part of me believed that I was handed this almost Carlos Castaneda-like relationship where I was the student and they were the teachers.
Somehow I can't see, and obviously John and Yoko had other friends too, but given the fact that they were on the phone with you constantly, not to mention the times when you were physically with them, you must have been their closest friend because even other musicians that were friends of John's and Yoko's, I can't see them being on the phone with every single one of them all the time. So would you say that you were their closest friend?
I never used that phrase. I always used the phrase that they were mine. Because to get the honest answer to that question, you'd have to ask them.
Hmm.
And neither of them are in a position to offer an acknowledgement in the book or state that. It would also be uncharacteristic for them to do it. However, Sean Ono Lennon has publicly stated that I knew them better than anybody else. I don't want to paraphrase or quote Sean, but his public statement is out there and everywhere. He
Hmm.
was the one who encouraged me to write the book.
Oh, wasn't aware of that. Hmm.
I was visiting Yoko for her birthday 2 years ago, and Sean and I, well, in our conversations, because I've been close with Sean from the time he was a baby. Sean has always encouraged me to write a book, and I always kind of sloughed it off. But during that last visit, he was a little bit more emphatic. And you're absolutely right. They did have other friends, Peter and Lorraine Boyle, who would come to see them frequently,
Hmm.
and a handful of others. But no, in terms of the all-night phone calls and the confidentiality, they never let their hair down with anyone. They didn't feel that they could trust anyone. And Yoko said once to me that I should never make a promise to John that I couldn't fulfill,
Right.
because everybody that they've ever known wound up betraying them.
Interesting. I think one of the things that probably why they liked you so much and were close to you was because you were straight with them. You didn't treat them like they were gods, even though many people in this world would look at them that way. Um, you would say exactly how you felt. I would guess there must have been times when you expressed an opinion to them about something that they didn't agree with, and were there ever times when they were angry at you for that reason?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Um,
Because that's not in the book.
well, John didn't have much of a conciliatory approach when it came to people with different points of view. I did. That came as a result of interviewing more than 1,000 people on radio and television.
Hmm,
Dutiful interviewer does not bicker or try to overrun the program with his or her thoughts about what was said.
right.
Especially us. Oh, yeah. You'll recall a time that I was at the Dakota and we talked about a song John wrote called God.
Hmm.
God is a concept by which we measure our pain. And I made some comments about how I thought the song could be improved upon. And I had suggested that rather than make it all personal, I don't believe in Buddha. I don't believe in, and he goes down a litany of things he doesn't believe in. I thought it would be more inclusive if he sang to the listener, you might believe in Buddha, you might believe in Krishna, you might believe in Kennedy, but I just believe in me, Yoko and me. That's our reality.
Hmm,
Thought the song would work better that way.
right.
We don't have the bandwidth here for me to tell you John's reply to my suggestion. But I can tell you that was the very last time I suggested to John how he might improve his song.
Can I just interject something here? Because it seems to me that in a way he took your advice because serve yourself is pretty much what you just described. You might believe in this, you might believe in that, but
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that. I mean, you are correct, but one got the public treatment and was widely heard. The other one was more cult-like.
Hmm. I just wanted to say before I pass you over to Darren here, um, like Alan was saying, there are times here in the book where, you see the other side of John, especially, and there was one moment during the Lost Weekend, which you call the rock bottom part of the Lost Weekend, when he's at Lou Adler's house and he's drunk and he destroys his gold records and he says some kind of epithet to you, which you didn't handle very well, or you were very hurt by it. And then the next day, John phoned you up and apologized, and you actually hung up the phone on him.
Yeah. I mean, it
Oh,
was pretty much the way you described it,
yeah.
that it was a low point in the lost weekend. He had returned from an all-night session with Phil Spector that went badly, and he was very, very, very intoxicated, had to be restrained
Hmm.
because he was creating damage to a house, and there was a fear that he could hurt somebody present to
Hmm.
Spector's bodyguards or himself. And one of the bodyguards called me and asked if I would come over and see if I could do what I could do. And when I approached him, and I could see the state he was in, I mean, he was venomous, he was fuming, shouting.
Hmm.
And when I got a little closer to him and asked how he was, and tried to just use my voice as a calming tool,
Hmm.
he just shouted an epithet at me that was so wounding. I did not use the words in the book. And as I sit here and talk to you right now,
Hmm.
I recall it. I recall that moment. We were talking earlier about memory.
Hmm.
That's etched in my soul. It was devastating to hear somebody who I considered my best friend refer to me that way. I did go home. He slept it off and called me the next day. You used the word apology.
Hmm.
And he said, basically, paraphrasing, but this is close to an actual quote.
Hmm.
If that's the worst thing that I could possibly say about you, you couldn't be that bad after all, right? That's what I call a wimpy apology,
Hmm.
a matter of fact, dismissive apology. I was almost more offended by that one than something real. Since I wrote that, people say, couldn't you just suck that up? We've all been around people, even at football games, that get real drunk and say something. Uh, Either I'm too sensitive or else I'm getting soft.
Okay. Darren?
I'm curious, and it's in the book, and we just kind of just skimmed past that. The relationship between the three of you was, I guess it's safe to say, it was immediate. And they saw something in you um, that they were looking for, I guess, in the way of companionship on um, a friend a basis. They both, I guess, equally saw this quality in you that they could bring you into their inner circle. And um, once the bond was cemented, did you ever turn to them for the type of I don't know, the type of help or advice or whatever that they would come to you for? Did you have that type of relationship where if you were having a crisis of some sort or needed a shoulder or whatever the case might be, could you and did you turn to either one of them or both of them? And were they receptive to your needs?
Yes, I didn't bring my issues to them with great frequency, but I was lamenting the loss of a girlfriend, and the experience affected me a lot. And they offered me good counsel, and were very receptive and offered me thoughts about how I can get beyond that. I had returned from a funeral for Sal Mineo in
Mhm.
upstate New York. And when I returned, they insisted that I come over to the Dakota to talk. And I was inconsolable at the time. He was a very close friend of mine. He was stabbed to death in an alley by just some person who never met him, knew anything about him. Left him with his wallet and $9 or $10 in change because Sal had screamed. And I had been up all night because I flew the body to New York and attended this experience. And we sat at the kitchen table, and the two of them could not have gone out of their way more than to try and comfort me. I was in tears, of course. And it was one of the few times that we really had a conversation about bodyguards, about security, and their thoughts about death. I talked with them until the sun rose and then walked back to the hotel I always stayed in. Those are two that just jump off the screen at me. Uh, and besides the phone calls, at the bank, there are 50, 100 letters and postcards that they sent me from all over the world. Some of the letters going on for 2, 3, 4 pages. And there's even that sense of looking after me in some of the letters. So, yes, I listened more and perhaps showed a little greater interest during their times of need than they paid attention to me, but it's partially my fault. How could they have known or consoled if I didn't bring things to them? And I did worry, like any good friend would worry, that if you bring bad news to somebody you love over and over and over again, you are less welcomed.
Mm.
Or at least that's how I felt.
Right, right. Did your bond with them had to have been different, because their personalities were different. Did you find at the very beginning that you uh, could relate more to John or Yoko? Who would you say initially was warmer, or you were able to, or they embraced you more so than the other? Not to say that the other person didn't like you, but who was the more inviting of the two as your friendship was forming?
Yoko.
Hmm. I thought, I figured you would say that. It just seemed like she would um be in tune better with someone.
She was softer and a very, very good listener and intuitive. And whereas I never suggested that she was psychic, I think she could read me more. She seemed to have paid more attention to me. John had some hard edges and carried more than 1 or 2 chips on his shoulder. And at the risk of sounding old-fashioned, Yoko is also a woman. And I've always found it easier for me to talk with and to relate to women throughout my entire life. To this day, all of my close friends have always been women. So, in answer to your question, it was first Yoko. John warmed up to me over the years, of course, but he had a very manly, macho side to him, and he was not that lovingly emotional.
Hmm.
I know that when you were writing this book, you didn't set out. I mean, well, I guess maybe you did want to include the good, uh, the bad, and the ugly within reason. But some of the good really did play out very comical, and there were some very funny moments. And I have to ask you to tell us the story. As somebody who worked in radio and who plays music 40 years, and knows the trouble you can get into when you air something that is perceived as off color. The story about hearing sometime in New York City, John and Yoko's album, 1972 for the very first time. And your relationship is still on the new side because you probably don't know them a year. It's less than a year, and you're given this gift. I mean, I picture John handing the record to you and it glowing like in the Pulp movie Pulp Fiction. Oh, this is, I'm going to play this tonight. I'll let you pick it up from there. To those who haven't read the book, or I read that as an excerpt and had to go find it and read it again just because it really made me laugh.
Whereas we had been all talking on the telephone for a number of months, there came a time when they came to California, Ojai, California, a little town about 100 miles from here. And they invited me to meet them in person. And we spent the day together. And before leaving, while I was en route to the car to get back to do my show, John said, "We want you to have this acetate." And it was just in a white container, no art on it at all, no identification of the names of the songs, just side one, side A, side B. Couldn't play it in the car, of course. It's a 33 and a third RPM record. Went right to the station, barely made airtime. And yeah, it was exuberant. I told the audience, we have a very special experience tonight. We're going to listen to the brand new album by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. I'm going to run some commercials now so we don't have to interrupt it. And I hope you just join me. The commercials went out of the way. I cued the engineer. He dropped the tone arm on the first song. And the first song is called "Woman is the End of the World." But he didn't use N.
No.
And the song was based upon a piece that Yoko Ono had written years before, with her assertion and belief that the most subjugated people on earth were women, and that she believed that women's treatment made them the ends of the world. John liked the concept that she was advancing. It was a pro-feminist song, of course, and he made this record. And I had the earphones on, and I heard the word, and I looked into the glass, and I saw my engineer on the other side, who's hearing this for the first time as well. It's his license, by the way, that would be in jeopardy for airing it. Maybe the radio stations. That word is heard all too frequently today in pejorative form, as well as in our culture. I still have never been comfortable with it. But then, in 1972, and that swiftly went into things like a song about Angela Davis, who was a socialist professor at Berkeley, and a song about freeing all of the inmates at Attica State Prison. And, let's put it this way, it was not an album that you could dance to. And it resulted, of course, in me packing my bag. I called them when I got home, or the next morning, whenever it was. And I said to John, well, I got some good news and I got some bad news. And he said, "What's the good news?" And I said, "Well, I played the entire album last night without commercials." And he took the phone away from his ear for a second, and I heard him screaming, "Mother, mother, he played the whole album without any commercials." And I heard her make some kind of sound. I mean, he was over the moon about that. I broke the record and played the whole thing on a very significant radio outlet that was heard clearly up and down Southern California. And he said, "What's the bad news then?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm going to be looking for work now." And he just, it wasn't a guffaw or a giggle. He found it hilarious, started laughing and shouted, "Mother, mother!" And they fired him. And I heard her laughing. They got a real good laugh. It didn't amuse me. And after, 5 or 10 seconds of that, he said, "What are you going to do then?" I said, "I guess I'm going to be looking for a job." And he said, "Look, we're leaving Ohio. We're going to drive up to San Francisco tomorrow. Why don't you come with us?" And I said yes. And that's when I joined the circus.
You also had an appointment with Salvador Dali that went awry. And that was another one that had me laughing out loud and reading the book. Because I had a similar instance bringing someone with me to an interview I had to do, and I never in my life thought that this person would interfere with what was my job, but it became a social event. And it was like, that's not, tell us, I mean, the meeting of the minds also, having John and Yoko and Salvador Dali come together. I ask you one more story, if you can tell us that recollection, that event.
People sometimes looking at us or hearing about what we do for a living really kind of think it's kind of a fun thing. You go around and you talk to interesting people, and they don't understand that it really is a job and it
Yeah.
really work. And we're not getting together here over a couple of glasses of Chardonnay. I was in New York, and I had gone there to do a series of interviews for the radio syndication company that I was working for at the time. And on one occasion, I'm with John and Yoko, and they say, "So, who are you going to be talking to? Who are you going to be interviewing?" They're always curious about that. And I said, "Well, I'm looking forward tomorrow to go to interview Salvador Dali at the hotel in Manhattan that we stayed at." And Yoko said, "We knew Dali. We haven't seen Dali in years." And it's true. And they said, "We'll go along with you." And even when I heard this suggestion, I knew that this was going to be problematic, that they were not going to be sitting in a corner, carefully listening to Dali and I having a conversation. I kind of knew it. I also knew that there was no way to say no. So dutifully, the next day, I took a cab up to the Dakota, and the three of us went to see Salvador Dali. He was a tough interview to begin with. I mean, technically, his pronunciation, the way he spoke, was heavily laden with his native Spanish tongue. So you couldn't quite hear him. He was a self-promoter. He was very verbose and grandiose and talked about himself and a different person. Dali best. Dali do. Nobody do before Dali. He was used to that. But I wanted to ask him about the influence that psychedelic drugs may have had in the creation of his paintings, how much time he dwelled upon themes before he picked up, the interview questions. And it was, 3 minutes into it where he said something and Yoko said something back, in a kind of convivial way. And I looked over my shoulder and, had a microphone in my hand. And he said something else and John chimed in. And within 5 minutes, John and Yoko turned this into a social engagement. Gala was there, his wife. And the interview just got lost. I have a YouTube channel where, for some unknown reason, I still keep the interview available to people. It's free to
Oh.
listen to. It's the worst interview I ever did on radio and television. It was a complete abysmal failure. I'm incredibly embarrassed about it. It's there probably to keep myself leveled.
Mhm.
And of course, uh, I didn't really get the lesson of the moment because I also did an interview with Baba Ram Das downtown at his apartment where he invited me over to speak with him. And he was a great spiritual influence on me. And John and Yoko were suspicious of him and insisted that they come along to Ram Dass's apartment. And I brought them along. There were just a handful of other people. It was small, and Baba Ram Dass talked about his spiritual journey, and he was incredibly articulate, and it was all pretty magical for me. And when he was reaching a completion, Yoko said from the back of the room, "There's something about this that sounds kind of phony." Room kind of became silent. And I realized that this was a tremendous mistake. So much so that I went back to the hotel, and 5 or 6 hours later, the operator woke me up, and I always had a do not disturb till noon. And I said, yes, yes, what is it? And she said, there's a man on the telephone. He says his name is Ram Dass, and he needs to talk to you right away. Put him through, please. And it was Ram Dass lamenting what had occurred the night before, asking if I was free to come down to his apartment alone. And it would be the two of us in the apartment to do a better version. I did. I asked him one question. I said, for people who have no idea who you are, tell us about your journey. He talked for the next hour and a half. And I said, thank you, and turned the machine off. And there are excerpts of Ram Dass in my archives as well. Those were the only two interviews that John and Yoko ever escorted me. I learned my lesson the hard way.
That's too funny. That's too funny. Thank you for sharing those. So let's go back over to Allan.
Okay, we have um, there were a lot of picking up sort of on Darren's amusing stories in the book. There were quite a number of things where, we've all read an awful lot about John Lennon over the years, and so a lot of things were not entirely surprising, but we don't often get the sort of granular detail. For instance, his inability to deal with money. A lot of that was actually kind of interesting in a, the stars are not like us kind of way, we have to all work it out, but it's just sort of, even having read it before, that it's still kind of astonishing that John wasn't really able to deal with the concept of what things cost and what they're worth and how to pay for it and all that. And the funniest instance of this in the book was his Las Vegas betting system. You know, it just was, really, he's John Lennon. He's brilliant. How could how could he not go from, A to B here? But I mean, you must have seen a lot more of that than is in the book because, you were
Countless.
traveling with him and
Please keep in mind that John was famous when he was 15 years old in Liverpool. The only thing that ever changed was that he got to perform on a larger stage incrementally. He had groups before the Beatles. And when he walked down the street in Liverpool, coming home from art school, people knew who he was. And there came a point during the Cavern days in Liverpool where he did need somebody around him, a fellow named Mal Evans, the late Mal Evans, to look after him. And somewhere around that time, John lost any sense of contact with currency. To the best of my knowledge, John Lennon had never been in a grocery store. He had never gone shopping. Certainly hadn't been in the bank. And when he would be at a restaurant, somebody else would always be taking care of the tab or paying for him. But he didn't know, what kind of a tip to include or anything like that. That's why during the Lost Weekend, Yoko suggested that his assistant would take care of that myriad of the support system detail. So I understand why he just didn't get it. There was no causal effect. And look at the jam the Beatles got into as a result of their financial issues and selling away their copyrights and the likes.
Mhm.
In my very first interview with John, 1971, 72, I asked him about his relationship with money. And he said that when the group had broken up, he had gotten to keep 1 mil, which meant he had gotten to keep $1 million. This is a group that Lord only knows how many hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars they earned. And Paul and John got away with some money because they were the ones who wrote most of the songs. He even told me he could only guess what Ringo or George went away from. More interestingly, he said on air, suggested on air, that that was a good thing, that that was a ton of money. Now, Yoko obviously took that 1 mil and turned it into a grand number that we can only be astonished by. But I think it's another example of his disconnect with cash.
Mhm. He also had, his kind of a disconnect, or should have had more of a disconnect with alcohol than he did. And it was one of your jobs to keep him away from it. And that somehow sounds easier than it probably was, and particularly like when you went to Japan and he wanted to go out, which you, so there you've got two violations of what Yoko wanted, she wanted you to stay in the hotel. He wanted to go out and he says, yeah, I know what she said. Goes out and I want some sake. I mean, it puts you in a position where, you can't really prevent him, but you're sort of obligated to Yoko to try to prevent him. That must have been difficult. I don't know how often a thing like that happens, but hope not too much. But obviously in LA it happened a lot, and on that Japan trip.
We Well, I've known a number of people who have the disease of alcoholism. And whereas most of us take this matter fairly lightly, I do enjoy an occasional glass of Chardonnay, and I don't go out and look for somebody to punch. But there are people in our society that are so helpless when it comes to handling alcohol that the only way I know to deal with it is abstention. And AA is an incredibly useful tool with, I'm told, about a 50% quote success rate of helping people maintain their sobriety. John couldn't drink at all. And like most people who have a drinking problem, didn't really feel that it was a problem. So you cite a night in Tokyo, Japan, where we're staying at this giant hotel called the Hotel Okura. And Yoko liked it because it was, well secured, and there were lots of restaurants and places within the complex, so John wouldn't have to go out in public. Because she knew, in the congested streets of Tokyo, if a person appeared looking like an ex-Beatle, it would create problems. And one night it did, because we had been coped up in that hotel for weeks. And John had it. Yoko went off on an appointment. And, we did what we always do. We sat in the living room and we talked. We had food sent up. He never wanted to go downstairs to the restaurants. And he said, let's go out. I said, well, we can't do that. And he said, I feel like getting outside. Let's get out. And although I was told he should not be out, we called a cab and we went someplace in Tokyo. And we're walking down a street or two, heavily congested, and he sees a sake bar. And he says, let's go in there. I said, John, there are a lot of people. It's very crowded there. I think it's best if we keep walking. And he said, let's go in there. And we went in there. And it was, Times Square and New Year's Eve. And everybody was downing sakes. And he said, get me one. Well, at that moment in time, what would any of you have done?
I don't know. That's a
Done
tough
what
one.
he
I
wants.
guess you'd have to get it
Done
for
what he
him.
wanted.
I got him one. That disappeared faster than I just said the word one. I need two or three. And I started hearing the murmuring around the room. And it was apparent that he was being recognized. And I said, I think we should get out of here. We did. We started walking down the street. And, these bars are in every corner. And we came up to another one, and he wanted to go in there. And by now, it was turning into a crowd control situation. We had no bodyguards or any security whatsoever. And these places are filled with plate glass windows. And I know what can happen to an unruly mob or crowd, even well-meaning, who just want an autograph, who just want to shake a hand, when there's pushing and shoving and screaming. We didn't speak the language. And, I held him, fortunately was able to hail us a cab and got out of there in time. And we went back to the hotel. And Yoko was waiting. And John made a U-turn by the hall door to the bedroom, one of them. And Yoko had a talk with me. And I had violated two of her wishes that she trusted me with. And she didn't know how I could have allowed that to happen. And, what kind of an argument could I present it to her? Nobody tells John Lennon what to do, and it could be argued that nobody tells an alcoholic that they shouldn't drink. If they make the decision not to drink, it's only them that can make it. You just can't interfere. But it was all wimpish, and I took it. And of course, she was right. And the next day, John walked down the hallway to my very small room in the hotel. And he said, had to go with mother last night. And I said, not good. And he said, well, I thought she might be a little upset with you. And I was going to say, a little upset with me. I mean, do you not have any participation in what took place with mother and I? That's how it happened. And it happened in LA constantly during the lost weekend, to a point where there was no dialing it back. When he and Harry Nielsen or Alice Cooper or Mickey Dolenz or the gang wanted to go to the Troubadour Bar or the Rainbow Bar or wherever they wanted to go, and alcohol and substances were flowing, what could I do?
Yeah.
Except try to keep my eye open to where the back door might be, try to make a phone call in advance to see to it that there'd be a car waiting, try to leave them for a few minutes to make certain that the car was there. How many people were waiting by the back door? Would there be another entrance for us to escape from? Who's going to be in the car? Will there be room in the car? Will John be able to climb down this ladder from a little private room and make it on his own? Was anybody carrying anything on them? Was there any white substance on their nose? Doing, preventive care. But what could I do?
So the end of the book, the last two chapters, I was probably in my mid-20s at the time that happened, and I remember that entire week vividly. And I was just a listener, really, or, I was writing and everything, but I had no connection to John, hadn't interviewed him, anything like that. I mean, he was just someone I'd known all my life as a star. Uh, for you, it was a very, very different thing. And reading those chapters, I felt like I was aware of the amount of pain it must have taken to actually write them. Um, how did you get through that? I mean, in two whole chapters worth, it just it was painful. Um, just wondering how, like, as a writer, having to come to terms with it and sit in front of the computer and do it, having lived through that.
I refer to it as Channel A and Channel B.
Mm.
And the Channel A side of my life still grieves. And recalling those memories still puts me back in that moment where I had lost my best friend. And there's some things that you just don't really ever recover from. You just learn to cope with an emotion that's heartbreaking. Channel B is I wanted to share my story with people, many of whom were not even born when John was taken. How best could I tell that story with accuracy and clarity? Single-minded, purposeful exchange. And I had to turn off Channel A and keep typing. They were probably, that last chapter may have been the most difficult for me to have done. The book came, relatively quickly. I wrote it in 6 months or so. And some of the chapters were just easy, especially the funny ones, or going to Las Vegas or Japan. But, nothing could set me up for recalling in specificity that last moment. And answer to your question, I had to put my heart on hold.
I think it's still in there, though. I think we see it when we're reading it.
I couldn't be completely impervious to what I was feeling.
Mm-hmm.
You read what the editor felt would be the best way. I certainly went on for more pages about the internal activity that was going on in the Dakota, lengthy conversations with Yoko about pain and suffering, loss, forgiveness, endless conversations with the district attorney's office and the police and the press, the people who wanted to get to her for comment, thieves around her who were taking precious things that belonged to John. I mean, I never slept at the Dakota. To this day, I had not. I would always go back to the hotel after being there for endless hours just to be able to breathe. And God only knows how she got through that time.
Okay, I will pass you back to Ken.
Okay, a few things I really want to talk to you about. First of all, even though you said John didn't talk about the Beatles that much, there is one paragraph in here that I want to read from your book. You say John had complicated, mercurial feelings about his fellow Beatles, to put it mildly, and it was impossible to predict at any given moment what he might say about any of them. He loved Paul as a brother, of course, but sometimes hated him like a brother too. The sibling rivalry between them ran soul deep, especially when Paul and his new band Wings chalked up another hit on the charts. Can you recall conversations that you had with John discussing the other Beatles about this or about Paul specifically?
Oh, yes. I never heard him say a derogatory word about Ringo.
Hmm.
Frankly, I've never heard anybody say a derogatory word about Ringo.
Hmm.
I had done a lengthy interview with Ringo before I had gone to Japan. And I just took the 2-hour cassettes and threw them in my bag, thinking that maybe one quiet night John might like to hear it. And it was the most in-depth interview, if I might say so, I've ever heard with Ringo. He loved to tell the old stories. And one night, I set up the little tape recorder and played it to John in the room. He laughed. He would say, "That's right, he got that right." And when it was over, he had, again, he affirmed his closeness to Ringo. Worried again about did Ringo wind up with any money from all of it, because Ringo was even functionally illiterate at the time, would not know what a contract even meant. With George, I always felt a bit of a chill wind. With Sir Paul, yes. When Sir Paul had those mega hits after the group broke up with Wings and was riding at the top of his game, John had an issue with that. He felt he should be there. He felt he should be receiving the same accolades that Sir Paul was, drawing the same crowds, feeling that kind of adulation. And when I would say, "John, you haven't recorded anything. in years. How could you get the same adulation and play for a large crowd? And he told me I was missing the point. And the point was how Sir Paul's popularity was making John feel internally. He had a healthy sense of jealousy towards Paul over Paul McCartney's hits and success. And sometimes he would be critical about individual songs, like silly little love songs. And he realized that. And then there were other times where a song was mentioned that was purely a Paul McCartney song. And John gave him great kudos and complimented him enormously on what he had created. John talked to me about Sir Paul in very unflattering ways and extremely loving ways. The most loving was when he was recalling their very early relationship and would say, Ellie, you only knew me after we were Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show and all of that. But Paul and I knew each other way before you did, or way before any of the others did. And he would recall going to Paul's flat and sitting in their parlor room and doing those first early songs together and how they could do it almost without talking with each other, almost telepathically. And very important for viewers of your podcast and readers of the book to know in our very last conversation about Sir Paul. You can watch it on that famous video of us walking down the beach in Malibu, where I asked him at the end about the possibility of a Beatles reunion. And I also asked, do you have any hard feelings about any member of the group? And he said, paraphrasing close to a quote, no, the wounds have all been healed. And if they called me up tomorrow and said, let's play, I'd play. At the time of his death, he only had good and positive feelings towards Paul McCartney. Just not me speaking, but you could see it in other interviews and references. They were married to each other from the time they were just kids, teenagers. And as is the case with any marriage, they're going to be bumps along the highway, but they were resolved.
Hmm.
And I hope Sir Paul knows them.
Towards the end of your book, you mentioned that John and Yoko and Paul and Linda had a Christmas lunch together, which I never knew anything about.
Yeah, I went to, it was during Christmas time, and they invited me over to the Dakota. I was in New York. And I went, and they had a single branch of a Christmas tree in a vase in the middle of the living room. That was the Christmas decoration. And we sat down and we just talked the way we usually talked. And 5 or 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. And there was, at the time, I don't think he had been knighted. There was Paul McCartney and Linda, his wife. And he introduced me to them. And we sat for a few seconds. And John said, well, let's go eat then. And they must have had some conversation about Paul and Linda coming over and even picking a restaurant. And we got into Paul's car and went up to Elaine's, which was kind of the celebrity hangout in Midtown Manhattan at the time. And Woody Allen and Gore Vidal and, all those people would be in that room. And we had a lunch together. There was nothing on the menu that they liked, so Linda had suggested there was a pizza place not too far away and asked if anybody would take offense if I would go up to the cash register and ask Elaine if we could have a pizza delivered. Major faux pas. And so I don't think there'd be any problem at all. And I arranged for the pizza as they wanted it to be delivered. Came through the back, taken out of the box, put on a very fancy Elaine's plate, brought out. Every eye in the room was on this table. It was a pleasant, simple pizza lunch. We returned to the Dakota. And I was on the fifth wheel again here. I sat on the couch. Linda and Yoko kind of went off together to talk. Yoko loved Linda McCartney. And Paul and John gravitated towards this very large window looking down the west side towards downtown Manhattan. And I could just pick up some words. Here is where my reportage fails me. I'm just sitting there on the couch, and I'm watching their body language, looking at that branch in the vase. And I do recall Paul saying to John, "So you're working on anything?" And John said, "No, no. I spend all my time looking after my baby. That's what I do. What about you?" And Sir Paul, well, Paul at the time said, "I'm always working on music. I'm always writing something, doing something. Couldn't be without it." And I had thought at that moment in time, if John said, "Look, I got a couple of guitars in the other room. You want me to bring them out?" Certain Paul would have said yes. I have no doubt they would have sat down in the living room and just started picking away. And maybe the result of that could have changed the face of contemporary music forever. Pipe dream. The McCartneys left. John, Yoko, and I talked a little bit about the visit. Of course, it seemed more important to me, this unexpected kind of reunion, than it was to them. Again, to John, it was just, there's Paul. You've seen that face a zillion times. And we didn't talk about it again. I've run into Paul McCartney on a number of occasions since. He's always been incredibly respectful, and he and I eat at this secret place 5 miles from where I'm speaking to you. And he likes to go there with his current wife from time to time. And it wasn't long ago that we just were seated in booths close to each other and had a little talk. It was nice.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. What year was that when that happened? What year was that when that all happened, the Christmas lunch?
77 or 78? Could it have been that late? I think so. I don't.
If John wasn't recording,
yeah,
it would have been within a year or two of that.
Yeah.
So
Paul used to go to New York every Christmas to spend Christmas with the Eastmans and New Year's with his family. And we know that he didn't go in 79. So it could have been 78. That's the closest we've been able to figure out.
I'm certain I could research it more, or when your podcast goes public with the kind of following you have, they'll tell us what time in the afternoon we got to. I know that.
And you said that where George is concerned, that there was like a chill when talking about George?
You know, and viewers of your podcast know, listeners, that John had issues with organized religion, and John had issues with with the worshiping of God as a deity or something external from self. And it was George, of course, who was so touched initially by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and suggested that the group at the time all go to India and to try and study with Maharishi. And later, John would make public pronouncements of a negative nature concerning Maharishi. They were all ill-advised comments, but that was just John. I believe in the folklore, he wrote the song Sexy Sadie about Maharishi.
He did.
He made a fool of everyone. George clinged very tightly to his religious beliefs and, of course, to the teachings of Maharishi Mahesh Yoga. And it was something that I don't think they really could get past in conversation. And yes, George, who I have great appreciation for and saw frequently in LA, he never missed a Bob Dylan concert. I was representing Bob, and I would always arrange for him to have a chair and a glass of water behind a curtain backstage where he had a direct view of Bob. I attended all of the Wilbury sessions with Bob. So, I was an eyewitness to all of that. But it's true, when George wrote his autobiography, he never once mentioned John. And John took note of that and mentioned it to me. And I would say, look, John, when you write your autobiography, you could decide who you're going to include in it or not. He had his reasons and choices. And he blew up at me and told me to stop with my radio PR talk, gobbledygook. The name wasn't in the effing book.
He mentions it in interviews too. He said George mentioned every two-bit guitar player, but I'm not even there. He did say publicly that bothered him.
I didn't know of that quote. So by the way, I don't know. In many ways, John was a creatively jealous person. And he was jealous of the success of others. And, he had an issue with Bob Dylan because people had perceived Dylan as the greatest lyricist of his time. Mm-hmm. But John believed he was. And he made it big. But in our conversations, isn't it possible that there could be two great lyricists from the 20th century? And couldn't it be true that Bob wrote a different type of music than you did, and that you were always revelatory in every one of your pronunciations, and he was more cloaked in mystery and the unwashed phenomena perception? And, that would set him off even more about the way people perceive of Bob. That was a thing with John. And I wasn't here. How can you debate jealousy?
Mm-hmm. Can you say anything? I know you're very polite in your book regarding May Pang. But whenever she tells a story, first of all, she wants us to believe that the lost weekend was not John getting drunk every single night, and that it was a very creative time for him. He did a lot of recording then. Well, I don't know about necessarily in LA. He did the startup sessions for rock and roll with Phil Spector there. He worked with Harry Nilsson on Pussycats. He worked with Ringo on Goodnight Vienna. Um, yeah, so I mean, it was a creative time for him. So in her mind, he couldn't have been on the bottle every single night. And she also alleges that after John went back to Yoko, that John and her still had a relationship going. Can you respond to that?
Sure. Um, I deliberately did not include anything of a negative nature about May Pang
Mm.
because I liked her. I got along with her. I thought she was doing a great job. She was sent here primarily by Yoko's request to look after John and tend to all those issues that we had discussed earlier that John was simply incapable of fulfilling. And she did that expertly and devotionally. Obviously, having read her book and seen her movie, May believed that John was in love with her, and she declared her love for him. And I would never, ever quarrel with her perception of that. I honor it.
Hmm.
So people have tried to get me to say something mean about her. The only thing that did disturb me sometimes was during the course of her interviews, she was very caustic about Yoko. She didn't have kind things to say about Yoko. And I felt that was uncool, but it's her right of freedom of expression. There are a lot of people who don't think of Yoko in positive terms. Fortunately, less now than there were then. As for what may have occurred between her and John after John returned to the Dakota, after the birth of Sean, I can't speak to that because I have no direct knowledge of that. My book was about the fact that I was there.
Hmm.
In these other pronouncements, I wasn't there. I don't know. The only thing that I factually elucidate upon is the fact that ultimately John went back to Yoko, had a son with Yoko, and a life with Yoko. That was his choice. And I let those facts remain with the same degree of conviction as me believing that May was totally in love with him and good for John, really good for him. I couldn't have imagined him getting through that period of time in his life with a lesser woman than May.
Okay. Very nice. Nice words there.
And by the way, I'm always polite. I mean, I learned from my parents not to use four-letter words and to treat everyone with respect and reverence. So it's not, I wrote a book and I want to, give polish to the characters in the book. I'm polite, but I'm honest.
Hey, remember in the movie Help what John said to Ringo, What was it that first Ringo said to John, what was it that first attracted you to me? John said, well, you're very polite.
I don't remember.
Darren?
I guess we'll close things out by talking about two individuals that didn't, I guess we didn't touch really on them yet at all, and that's Sean and Julian, and your relationship with the two of them. Uh, it had to have been, I mean, I don't know how well you knew. I mean, Sean was a baby, um, and I don't think Julian was around much at all. in the late, in the 70s. And if he was, perhaps you met him in, passing. Um, the relationships, though, developed after John's death, and it had to have been extremely difficult because you, in essence, in a way, ended up with two sons. Definitely in the case of Sean. Tell us about how the relationship with Sean developed and also with Julian. And Julian, of course, coming into this picture, um, maybe probably, in fact, I think it's safe to say felt like an outsider, period. Um, Elaborate more on the relationship with Sean and Julian, and if that's possible, in a quote unquote nutshell,
It's that last word of
or a
doing
very big nutshell.
in a nutshell. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, Podcast part 2. If you read the book, you'll know that I met Sean Ono Lennon when he was 2 or 3 weeks old. John invited me to New York to meet their son. And it was also a day when not only did I meet baby Sean, but John explained to me that they had originally considered naming me as Sean's godfather, but they had settled on Elton John because he would wind up giving him better Christmas presents. That's exactly what he said, which was both true and wounding. I mean, not horribly wounding, but and certainly Sir Elton does marvelous things on behalf of Sean. But I was there during those early years. I watched how John would end the day when we'd be in the kitchen together by putting Sean in his arms and carrying him off to bed, slowly whispering about the things they did together that day, softly. And by the time they would get to Sean's bedroom, Sean would be virtually asleep. And I was around for key moments in Sean. I'll recall one for you. I don't know if it's in the book. There was a man who lived in the Dakota building named Mervyn Leroy. And Mervyn Leroy was a very, very famous restaurateur in New York City. He owned Tavern on the Green restaurant and other places as well. To my knowledge, he had the only triplex in the Dakota. And one room was a screening room. And one afternoon, he buzzed down and John, I don't know where, John may have been asleep. And he said to Yoko, we're screening a movie and would Sean like to come over? They had a son named Max Leroy, the boy that Sean would grow up and become best friends with. And she just asked that I take Sean up the elevator and go to the Leroys. We did. And without me knowing in advance, the movie was Yellow Submarine. We watched it, and I occasionally glanced over at Sean, then younger than 5, becoming engrossed by it and nodding his head to the music. And when I brought him back, John was at the kitchen table with Yoko. And Sean walked into the room and looked at his father and said, "You're a Beatle?" It was the first moment that Sean made that observation of the link between the man at the kitchen table and the other larger than life identity. He would have no reason to think differently at the time. John didn't walk around playing videotapes or talking about being a Beatle. And John said, yes, but that was a very, very long time ago. And John kind of glanced at me for a second, thinking that maybe I fanned that ember. And Sean said, Yellow Submarine, and started, singing it. And John joined him. And then John started singing it, but he was having trouble remembering the words. So it was more like, yeah, well, we all lived in a yellow submarine, and he was reaching for the next lyric. The two of them had a verbal jam session just around that one song. I would see Sean on Christmases and Thanksgivings, holidays in New York. And after 1980, he would come stay with me at my house in Laurel Canyon for various periods of time during the summer. And we remained in constant contact after all these years, to this point where he was the one who encouraged the book. And I was with Sean last when he received an Oscar for Best Short Film that he participated in, escorted Charlotte and Sean to the red carpet and the ceremonies afterwards. Had breakfast with them the next morning. And Sean and I either talk or text frequently. Julian was introduced to me by his father when he was just barely a lad. John had obviously been up all night. It was during the time of the lost weekend. And I heard a man at the bottom of the canyon, the bottom of my house, screaming, wake up, I want you to meet my boy. 5 o'clock in the morning or so. And I brought them into the house, and a very shy young Julian was introduced to me. He gravitated towards a telescope I had. And John said, come with us, we're going to go to Disneyland. And I barely could wipe the sleep out of my eye. And I said, I don't know if I'm up for that, but afterwards we could all have a lunch together. I would not see Julian again until the day after his father was murdered, when he came to New York. And I spent time with him. Yoko wanted him to be in New York, but she was not emotionally equipped to help console the still very young Julian, the teenager by now, and asked me to get him out of the Dakota because it was so depressing there for obvious reasons. And I said, where will I take him? And you could take him to places where there'll be no press. I don't want anybody having to take pictures of him. And we got into a cab, and the first destination I thought he might like was the World Trade Center building because of their views. And I took him there. And then we went to another building. Then we went somewhere in Greenwich Village, and there were no photographers. And I took him through the back door of the Dakota building. Julian would wind up becoming a neighbor of mine, living less than a mile from where I currently am. Julian and I would become pals, primarily drinking pals. And we would go out frequently together to local clubs. And Julian did like to have a sip or two as well, friend in the family. For a very brief period of time, I represented Julian. He asked me to do some PR stuff for him. And I did. I think I was recording the Lost Lennon tapes at the time, and I asked Julian if I could do an interview with him. And I did. It's an hour-long interview. It's you could just Google Elliot Mintz interviews Julian Lennon. He was incredibly candid with me. very bright, pensive young man. He had his issues with Yoko at the time, and I, again, tried to bridge those issues and assured him that it would work out well. I was texting with Julian 2 nights ago. I had mentioned that my wrist had gotten sore because I had been autographing all of these books. And he said, in the text, I'm paraphrasing, but it's close, "Welcome to the autograph club. For my children's books, I autographed 30,000 of them."
Wow.
30,000 books. And I told him that he was a master member of the autograph club, and I was, for right now, just trespassing. My relationship with him is good. The relationship between Julian and Sean is tight.
That's great.
They really love each other, spend time with each other, attend events that both of them are doing separately by way of showing support. I never heard Sean or Julian say a negative word about the other. We're in a different time now where love prevails. You know, as Sean now begins to enter into middle age and Julian is there, I'm surprised when people speculate about any kind of separation. And, you know, Julian has gotten over all of his early issues with Yoko. He's a good kid.
Since you just mentioned it, one of the few omissions, glaring omissions from your book was the Lost Lennon tapes. And as someone who's thanked Yoko many times for that series and for all the other tremendous work she's done, especially these archival box sets that have come out these last few years, you never discussed the Lost Lennon tapes in your book. Is there a reason for that?
I didn't feel it was germane because I did them after John's murder.
Hmm.
It was not part of the point of the discussion between all of us. And in fact, even after they aired, we're talking about hundreds of hours of unreleased John Lennon material that I worked with Stephen Peoples and another person on to assemble and to air. Yoko and I never discussed it either. Every day when I would leave the studio and I had a new hour-long thing, we would send an acetate to New York for Yoko and to be kept in her files. And no, she never commented on it at all. I called after that walk on the beach in Malibu. I called John the next day and asked if he had watched it. Just curious.
Hmm.
And he said, "No, why would I watch it? I was there." So some of these moments that really seem, important to us, and the one thing that the four of us share is a sense of the importance of archiving, of preserving.
Yeah.
Not as much with them. Thank God for Sean, who has done all these remarkable remixes, and as we speak, is nominated for a Grammy Award, along
Here,
with
here.
Simon Hilton
Yeah.
on the Mind Games box set. Sean wants everything having to do with his parents to not only live on, but live on in various formats and presentations more acceptable to a younger generation with just discovering them.
all these box sets have been tremendous.
He
All the work
works,
poured into them.
when he's in the studio working on these box sets and doing these remasterings, which he does himself, hands-on. Of course, there's a team effort to put together all of this stuff,
Hmm.
but it comes under Sean's tutelage. And when he's doing it, you try and get a phone call through to Sean. No way.
Mhm.
He's the best son a mother could have ever wished for.
Okay. Should we wind up?
That is the perfect way, I think,
Yes.
to wind things up. Um,
So I'll do
so
sort of it.
yeah,
So thank you so much, Elliot, for spending all this time with us. We could go on for another 3 or 4 hours. And uh, and now we all are going to be looking forward to volume 2, which will have more about Yoko, Sean, and Julian, and Dylan, and the Wilburys, and Paris Hilton, and the Lost Lennon tape. So it's
does
not like you don't have stuff to write about.
Alan, does Elliot know about the McCartney legacy and the books that you're writing? Because
Possibly, but there's why?
Alan is, do you see the red and blue back there? That's the red is the McCartney Legacy Volume 1. Volume 2 is blue coming out in December. And last I heard is that there will be 5 volumes
Um,
in McCartney Legacy. So he's I think Alan writes as when he's asleep,
of
he's
course,
writing.
I,
So
I of course own the red version, and I noticed when I went on Amazon.com the other day uh, to look at how well my book was doing or how people thought of it that sent in reviews. Right next to it was Sir Paul's book, which is the book of books. And with a December release on the 2nd, look, Alan, I've been familiar with your work for the longest of times. And just to see my book next to Paul's back there, can put mine off to the side, not in front. What can I say about him and your skills? There are only a handful of people still around to be doing this. And everybody that I met that's doing something of a serious preservation nature, we owe a great deal of gratitude towards you. So congratulations on that and the next volume. And if you elect more, I don't know where you get all the information.
Thanks again, Elliot. This was
Elliot, thank you.
great
Thank you
fun.
so much.
This was a pleasure talking to 3 people far wiser than I in these subjects and in preservation of memories. Has been an absolute joy. If you ever need me again, you'll know where to find me.
Okay, so that was a fun interview, I think. One of the funnest interviews we've done in quite a while. And so glad to have Elliot on. And let's just go around the horn, as Darren says, and talk about what we're up to, how to reach us, all that. Start with Darren.
All right. Well, you can listen to me on WFUV on the air Monday through Thursday nights, starting at 10 p.m. till 2 a.m. and Saturday afternoons from 1 until 4. So that's the one day of the week where I come out when the sun is out, as opposed to the weeknights when I'm out with the vampires and bats. WFUV 90.7 FM in New York City. And you don't have to be in New York City to listen because you can listen on our website, WFUV.org. And we have an app too, where you can listen to WFUV. So that's that. And you can, if you want to find me on Facebook, that's a great way to keep in touch with me because I have no life and I'm always on Facebook doing all kinds of things. Darren Devivo is one of the pages. The other is Darren Devivo, WFUV DJ and Beatles podcast or something like that. But look for me there and we'll be in touch. And that's it, right? The hours, FUV, blah, blah, blah. There you go.
Okay, Ken.
All right, you can always get in touch with me through my email, which is everylittlething@att.net. My radio show, Every Little Thing, which is heard on around 50 radio stations right now. The easiest way to listen to it is by going to WFDU's website. This is a radio station from New Jersey, from Fairleigh Dickinson University. And they run my show twice during the week, but then they also archive it and they keep it on their website, the last two shows, and each show runs for 2 weeks. So you can go to WFDU.FM, go to their archivals page, and type in Every Little Thing. So you can listen anytime you want. Every Little Thing on demand at WFDU.FM. My other talk show, Beatles Talk Show podcast, Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video cast. We just did a show recently on the 40th anniversary of the film, Give My Regards to Broad Street. And that was a delightful show to do. We had Edward Crawford on the show. He is the host of his own YouTube channel, Call Me Mr. Broadstreet. He's an expert on all things about the film and collects all kinds of memorabilia on the movie. And we had him on, and Dylan Seavey was on there, who is a Nashville musician who has been on my channel, Ken Michaels Radio, and Two Legs, and Talk More Talk. And he got to listen to Ringo's new country album, Look Up, and he gives us a little sneak preview of what it's all about in that show. We're going to be doing a show on Living in the Material World, the box set, this coming Monday, which is the 18th of November. And that should be a lot of fun. Just go to our YouTube channel, Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video cast. And that show is also heard on all audio platforms. Kid O'Toole co-hosts it with me, as does Tom Hunyadi from Two Legs, and Joe Mayo from Mean Mr. Mayo, his own YouTube channel. And then there's my own YouTube channel, Ken Michaels Radio. Just had Annie Nichols on from Two Legs, and we did a show. It's a feature I have called The Deeper You Go, where I ask my guests to pick 10 deep tracks from either the Beatles as a group or a specific solo Beatle. And Andy chose to talk about George Harrison. And he lists 10 deep tracks from his solo career that he feels deserve recognition. Songs that are anything but the hits. No My Sweet Lords, no What Is Life's, no Give Me Loves. All deep cuts. And so we got a tremendous reaction to that, 1,000 views for that show. Thank you to everyone that watched that. And the show before that, there's no chopped liver, my friends. We had a Wings reunion with Denny Seiwell, Lawrence Juber, and Steve Holly as a tribute to Denny Lane on what would have been his 80th birthday. You get to see the three of them together, share their memories of Denny. And of course, there's always my website, kenmichaelsradio.com. You can play along with Beatles trivia every couple of weeks and win one of 10 great prizes, including the McCartney Legacy, that real old one, volume one. Still have a copy of it. It's ancient now, but I still have a copy of it. You can win that book, and so many other great prizes. Gary Burr's book on a fictional Beatles reunion that takes place after Linda McCartney's passing. A lot of great stuff, all on my website. Lots of older interviews, strictly audio, that I've done through the years. Check them out. Upcoming releases are on there. If you hear me talk about these things in the news, books, CDs, DVDs coming out, theatrical releases, I put them on my website, and you can just follow them all in order of when they're coming out. And that's about it. Back to you, Allan.
Okay. You can find me on Facebook as well, and either Allan Kozinn or Allan Kozinn Remixed. There also is a McCartney Legacy Facebook page. And You can contact the three of us by email at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. And let's see what else. And we have a Facebook page, Things We Said Today Video Podcast, which is first place that we post all of the new shows as they're ready to go. Otherwise, just, keep an eye out for us on YouTube and Podbeam and any place that you get your podcasts. So thank you all for listening. And for Ken Michaels and Darren Devivo, I'm Allan Kozinn, and we'll see you next time.